haven, preserving the eternal annals of Warhammer.
In the dying light of a forgotten star, where the galaxy's edge frayed into darkness and memory, the ruins of an ancient world bore witness to victories that never officially occurred. The skeletal remains of hab-blocks stretched toward a crimson sky, like the ribs of some primordial beast, their ferrocrete bones bleached white by radiation and the weight of buried truth. Here, carved deep into stone that predated human settlement by millennia, the Hydra's mark lay etched over symbols of a dozen extinct cultures, evidence of conquest so complete that the conquered had forgotten they were ever free. The wind carried whispers of old ash and newer lies, while in the distance, the hulks of ships that existed in no imperial record lay half buried in dunes of crystallized sand. This was a world shaped by hands that left no fingerprints, its population believing their imperial compliance was as natural as breathing, never knowing they had been molded by shadows. The very air seemed to shimmer with deception, reality bending around truths too dangerous to speak aloud. In this place where victory had been so absolute it became invisible, the last traces of the Alpha Legion's greatest art remained hidden in plain sight. We want you to know, dear listeners, that we truly love and care for each of you who joins us on these journeys through the grim darkness of the far future. Your presence transforms these ancient tales from mere words into shared experience across the void of space and time. Before we begin this story of serpents and shadows, of loyalty twisted into betrayal and truth buried beneath necessary lies, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Light years away from that forgotten world, in the command chamber of the Alpha, Alfarius stood before a hololithic display showing the advancing fleet of Imperial compliance. The chamber existed in official records only as storage space, much like the Legion that had built it. Here, surrounded by the soft hum of hidden machinery, he contemplated the weight of victories that would never be celebrated and sacrifices that would never be acknowledged. Another world brought to compliance, came a voice from the chamber's entrance. Horus Lupercal strode forward, his presence filling the space like gravitational force, the War Master's confidence radiating from every movement. Your methods remain unique, brother. Alfarius turned from the display, his features bearing that unsettling quality common to his legion, perfectly familiar yet somehow wrong, as if reality itself couldn't quite decide who he truly was. We give them the war they need to feel righteous, the victory they require to feel strong. In return, they give us a world that will serve faithfully for millennia. Everyone receives what they desire. Everyone except the truth. Horus moved closer, studying the tactical projections with the eye of a conqueror who had never known defeat. Truth is a luxury we cannot afford, Alfarius replied, though something cold settled in his chest as he spoke the words. We deal in necessities. Horus was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the star charts. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight Alfarius had never heard before. I have been thinking about what comes after, brother. After the last world falls, after the Great Crusade ends, what becomes of weapons when there are no more wars to fight? The question struck like a physical blow. Alfarius had always assumed there would be another campaign, another world, another opportunity to prove worth through shadow and deception. The idea of an ending had never occurred to him, and now it loomed like a void in his carefully ordered universe. Father will have need of us, he said, but the words felt hollow, even as he spoke them. Will he? or has turned from the display, his eyes reflecting something dark and hungry? Or will we become reminders of a more violent age, relics when humanity requires administrators rather than conquerors? Before Alfarius could respond, the chamber's communication array activated with a soft, almost organic chime. The message waiting bore no origin signature, its encryption beyond even the Alpha Legion's considerable abilities to decode. As Alfarius reached for the controls, he felt something shift in the fabric of reality around him. Not a sound, but a presence pressing against the edges of his consciousness. The transmission contained no words, no images, only a sensation that bypassed rational thought entirely. It spoke of impossible choices and paths unseen, of futures where victory and defeat became meaningless distinctions. It whispered of a truth so terrible it could shatter empires, yet might be the only salvation for humanity itself. Horus stepped back, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon. "What is it?" "I don't know," Alfarius admitted, and the honesty of that admission felt like the first genuine thing he had said in years. The presence in his mind withdrew, leaving only an impression of vast intelligence and patient malevolence, something that had been watching, waiting for this moment when doubt finally found purchase in a Primarch's heart. As the communication array fell silent, Alfarius stared at the star charts with new eyes. The Great Crusade stretched before them, a tide of conquest and compliance that seemed unstoppable. But now, for the first time, he wondered if victory itself might be the greatest defeat of all. The weight of that possibility settled around him like a shroud, and he knew with terrible certainty that everything was about to change. The game had begun, though he did not yet understand the rules or recognize his opponent. In the shadows between stars, ancient eyes watched and waited, and the Hydra began its long, slow dance toward damnation. The world of Thessian Tertius died without knowing it was murdered. In the sprawling manufactorums beneath its primary hive, the Alpha Legion moved like ghosts through machinery that hummed with the rhythm of a civilization that believed itself free. The air tasted of recycled oxygen and industrial lubricants, but underneath lay something else. The metallic tang of deception so complete it had become indistinguishable from truth. Brother Sergeant Vex removed his helmet in the shadows between assembly lines, breathing air that felt thick with lies. Around him, his kill team performed their roles with mechanical precision. Operative Caney monitored Vox channels while wearing the uniform of a shift supervisor. Brother Thane adjusted production quotas from a data terminal he had no authorization to access. And Sister Null, one of the Legion's mortal assets, distributed pamphlets calling for voluntary integration with a distant Imperial protectorate that existed only in carefully forged documents. "Phase 3 is complete," Caney reported, his voice carrying the exhaustion that came from speaking in someone else's accent for 6 months. "The workers' councils have voted unanimously to petition for Imperial protection. They believe the motion was their idea." Vex nodded, but something cold settled in his chest as he watched the night shift change over. These people moved with the easy confidence of citizens who had never been conquered, never been enslaved, never been broken. They would go to their hab blocks tonight and tell their families about the wise decision their representatives had made, never knowing that every word of the debate had been scripted by the very forces they now welcomed. "The children drew pictures again," Thane said quietly, not looking up from his terminal. "In the education centers, golden eagles and serpents side by side. They're starting to dream about compliance before they even understand what it means." The word struck like a physical blow. Vex had seen those drawings himself, crude sketches that showed the Emperor's Aquila wrapped in the coils of a great serpent, as if some part of their unconscious minds recognized the truth their waking thoughts could never grasp. The psychological conditioning was working too well, seeping into dreams and children's games, reshaping reality at its very foundation. Mission parameters remain unchanged, Vex said, but the words felt like ash in his mouth. He had spoken similar phrases on 17 worlds, each one a masterpiece of manipulation that left entire populations grateful for their own subjugation. Yet something about Thessian Tertius felt different, tainted by the weight of unnecessary perfection. That was when he felt it, the same presence that had touched Alpharius's mind in the command chamber of the Alpha. It pressed against his consciousness like cold fingers, whispering of futures where victory and defeat became meaningless distinctions. For a moment, Vex saw himself as if from a great height, a warrior of the Emperor's finest legion, crouched in shadows while orchestrating the spiritual murder of an innocent world. Brother Sergeant, Sister Null approached, her face bearing the careful neutrality of someone who had forgotten her original name years ago. I've received contradictory orders through secondary channels. We're to accelerate the timeline while simultaneously maintaining operational security that requires us to slow our approach. Vex felt his blood chill. Contradictory orders were becoming more common throughout the Legion, as if different hands were moving pieces on the same board without coordination. Some brothers whispered that Alpharius himself was issuing conflicting directives, testing their loyalty, or preparing for some unimaginable contingency. Source verification, he asked. Both carry alpha-level authentication. Both claim Primarch authority. Her voice carried no emotion, but her eyes reflected something that might have been fear. Brother Sergeant, what do we do when the Hydra's heads begin to devour each other? The question hung in the recycled air, like poison gas. Vex stared at his gauntlets, remembering when they had been stained with honest blood from honest battles, not the invisible corruption that came from reshaping minds and souls. He thought of the transmission that had reached their Primarch, the presence that seemed to watch from the spaces between stars, and wondered if they were still serving the Emperor's vision or something far more ancient and patient. We follow the mission, he said finally, knowing it was no answer at all. Above them, Thessian Tertius prepared to celebrate its voluntary integration into the Imperium. The planetary governor would announce tomorrow that distant Terra had graciously accepted their petition for protection, never knowing that the petition had been written in Alpha Legion scriptoriums months before his world had been targeted for compliance. There would be parades, speeches, tears of gratitude for a salvation they had been manipulated into requesting. In the shadows between the assembly lines, Vex replaced his helmet and tried to remember the last time he had felt proud of a victory. The Hydra was beginning to question the taste of its own tail, and in that questioning lay the seeds of something that might have been wisdom or might have been damnation. The distinction, he realized with growing horror, no longer seemed to matter. In the mirror-black surface of the observation dome, Omegon watched two faces stare back at him. One belonged to Alpharius, carved from memory and habit, wearing the expression of certainty that had carried them through 100 campaigns. The other was his own, though he could no longer be sure which thoughts had shaped its features. The reflection shifted like water disturbed by an unseen hand, and for a moment he saw neither brother clearly, only the ghost of what they had been before the Legion taught them that identity was just another weapon to be wielded. The Alpha Alpha drifted through the void between stars, its hull scarred by battles that existed in no official record. Here, in the ship's deepest chambers, where even the machine spirits whispered in encrypted tongues, Omegon pressed his palm against the cold, transparent steel and tried to remember the last time he had been alone with his own thoughts. The gesture felt familiar, borrowed from some moment when Alpharius had stood in this same place, contemplating the same questions that now gnawed at the edges of consciousness like hungry parasites. When did we stop being two people who shared a purpose, he asked the empty chamber, and become one mind trapped in multiple bodies? The words emerged in Alpharius's voice, though he could not recall deciding to speak them. Perhaps his brother had asked the same question in some distant strategy room, and the thought had travelled through whatever quantum entanglement bound their souls together. The Vox system activated with its familiar chime, carrying reports from Thessian Tertius, where Brother Sergeant Vex struggled with contradictory orders that bore both their signatures. Omegon studied the tactical displays showing the world's voluntary integration into the Imperium, each data point representing another small victory in their campaign of invisible conquest. The people of Thessian Tertius would celebrate their decision tomorrow, never knowing that every word of their debate had been scripted by the forces they now welcomed. Yet something cold settled in his chest as he watched the night shift change over in the manufactorums. These people moved with the easy confidence of citizens who had never been broken, never been enslaved, never been conquered. They would return to their hab blocks and tell their families about the wise choice their representatives had made, carrying in their hearts a gratitude that was as genuine as it was manufactured. The children drew pictures again, came Vex's voice through the comm channels, heavy with exhaustion that spoke of more than physical fatigue. Golden eagles and serpents, side by side. They're starting to dream about compliance before they understand what it means. The words struck like shrapnel. Omegon had seen similar drawings on 17 worlds, crude sketches that showed the Emperor's Aquila wrapped in the coils of a great serpent, as if some part of the human unconscious recognized truths their waking minds could never grasp. The psychological conditioning was working too well, seeping into dreams and children's games, reshaping reality at its foundation. He thought of the presence that had touched their minds in recent days, ancient and patient, whispering of futures where victory and defeat became meaningless distinctions. What if their legendary efficiency had not been the result of superior planning, but manipulation by forces they had never recognized? What if they were not the architects of these bloodless conquests, but merely instruments in a game whose rules they did not understand? The tactical display flickered, showing the contradictory orders that were becoming more common throughout the Legion. One directive bore Alpharius's authentication, calling for accelerated integration through carefully orchestrated scarcity events. The other carried his own seal, demanding operational security that required a slower, more cautious approach. Both claimed Primarch authority. Both served the same ultimate goal. Yet they pulled in opposite directions, creating fractures that ran deeper than mere tactical disagreement. Brother, Alpharius's voice materialized through the ship's communication array, carrying undertones of uncertainty that made Omegon's blood chill. We need to discuss what we've become. I know what we've become, Omegon replied, staring at his reflection in the observation dome's surface. The question is whether we chose it or whether it chose us. The Cabal's presence grows stronger, Alpharius continued, his image flickering into a hololithic existence. It shows me visions of terror burning, of the Emperor entombed in golden machinery, of an Imperium that devours its own children across 10,000 years of stagnation. And then it shows me the alternative. Quick victory for chaos. A galactic fire that burns bright and brief, consuming itself before it can spread beyond our galaxy. The words hung between them like a blade suspended over everything they had built together. Omegon found himself thinking of the worlds they had brought to compliance, the populations who worshipped the Emperor not from fear, but from gratitude they had been manipulated into feeling. Each green marker on their tactical displays represented not a bloodless victory, but a spiritual murder so complete the victims thanked their killers. "We swore oaths," he said finally, though the words felt hollow. "To whom?" Alpharius's reply came like a whisper from the grave. "To the Emperor, who may have been using us as unwitting agents. To humanity, whose future we may be destroying through our very success. Or to ourselves, and the comfortable certainty that we were always the heroes of our own story." In the mirror-black surface of the dome, their reflections merged and separated like oil on water. Two faces becoming one, becoming none, until only the stars remained to witness their doubt. The void between stars shimmered with impossible geometries as reality bent around the coordinates that had summoned them. The Alpha drifted through space that tasted of copper and dying light, her hull scarred by battles that existed in no official record. In the ship's deepest chamber, where even the machine spirits whispered in encrypted tongues, Alpharius and Omegon stood before a presence that had been watching from the spaces between atoms since before humanity learned to count its own heartbeats. The chamber's walls pulsed with alien mathematics, crystalline formations growing from surfaces that should have been solid metal. The air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation, carrying scents of winter storms and ancient cedar that had no business existing in the recycled atmosphere of a warship. When the Cabal finally materialized, they came not as invaders, but as surgeons preparing to operate on the fabric of fate itself. The Eldar Farsa emerged first, her ancient eyes reflecting the weight of prophecies that spanned galaxies. Beside her, beings of living crystal hummed with frequencies that made reality shiver, while creatures that might once have been human stood wrapped in robes woven from the darkness between stars. At their center, something that defied classification spoke with a voice that bypassed the ears entirely and resonated in the bones of those who heard it. "You have felt our touch," the central figure intoned, its words carrying harmonics that spoke of civilizations risen and fallen. "You have tasted the edges of choice that will define your species' fate. Now witness the full weight of what approaches." Alpharius stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward weapons that would be useless against beings who existed partially outside conventional reality. "You've been manipulating us. The contradictory orders, the presence in our minds. We have shown you possibility," the Farseer interrupted, her voice like wind through empty tombs. "The manipulation comes from within your own nature. We merely provided the mirror in which you could see your true face." The chamber exploded into vision. Not images projected on screens, but realities forced directly into their consciousness with the weight of absolute truth. Alpharius felt his knees buckle as the first future unfolded before him like a flower blooming in reverse. He saw terror triumphant, the Emperor's golden light spreading across the galaxy like dawn breaking over an endless ocean. The Great Crusade reached its glorious conclusion, but in that victory lay the seeds of something far worse than defeat. The Emperor, broken by his final confrontation with Horus, was interred upon the golden throne, his psychic screams echoing across the galaxy as he became a living corpse sustained by the daily sacrifice of of 1,000 souls. 10 millennia passed in the space between heartbeats. The Imperium that followed was a festering wound across the stars. Humanity trapped in endless decline, ignorance elevated to virtue, hope rationed like water in a drought. Billions died not in glorious battle, but in the grinding machinery of an oppressive regime that had forgotten its own purpose. The psychic emanations of this suffering fed the very forces the Emperor had sought to defeat, ensuring chaos's eternal, agonizing sustenance. This is your future if the Emperor triumphs, the crystalline being intoned, its form shifting through spectrums that had no names. Humanity becomes everything it sought to destroy, superstitious, xenophobic, trapped in eternal stagnation, while chaos grows fat on their despair. The vision shifted like a kaleidoscope of damnation. Now Horus stood triumphant on Terror's throne, his victory swift and absolute. But this conflagration burned bright and brief. The forces of chaos, denied their slow feast of human suffering, turned upon themselves in an orgy of destruction that consumed the galaxy like wildfire. Within centuries, the flames had devoured everything, leaving only empty space where civilizations had once thrived. And this is the alternative, the farcer continued, her ancient features bearing something that might have been pity. A terrible fire that burns out chaos's influence forever, leaving the galaxy cleansed for younger races to inherit. Omegan felt the weight of impossible choice settling on his shoulders like a mountain of corpses. You're asking us to betray everything we've sworn to protect. We ask you to choose which betrayal serves the greater good, came the reply that tasted like rust and ashes. Betray your oaths to save your oath's true purpose, or maintain your loyalty, and watch it become the instrument of everything you despise. The visions continued, showing their legion's role in both potential futures. As loyalists, their skills became tools of oppression, their bloodless conquests used to crush hope rather than preserve it. As traitors, their sabotage ensured Horus's victory came swiftly enough to burn out before chaos could establish permanent dominion. The irony is exquisite, the Eldar observed. To save humanity, you must help destroy it. To preserve the Emperor's vision, you must ensure his defeat. In the silence that followed, Alfarius stared at his gauntlets, remembering when they had been stained with honest blood from honest battles. Now they seemed covered in something far worse, the invisible corruption of choices that had no right answers, only degrees of damnation. How do we know you speak truth? He asked, though the question felt hollow. Because lies would be kinder, the Cabal replied. We offer no comfort, no certainty that your sacrifice will be remembered, only the possibility that your species might survive its own success. The chamber began to fade as the aliens prepared to withdraw, leaving the twins alone with knowledge that felt like poison in their veins. The last thing they heard was a whisper that seemed to come from the grave itself. Choose quickly, sons of the serpent. Time grows short, and the galaxy's future hangs in the balance of your decision. In the returning normalcy of their strategium, surrounded by tactical displays that now seemed like children's toys, the weight of cosmic responsibility settled between them like a blade. They knew that whatever they decided would damn them in the eyes of history. The only question was which damnation would serve the greater good. The observation deck of the vengeful spirit stretched before them like a cathedral of war, its vast transparasteel windows framing the burning majesty of the Ulanor system's dying star. Fleet formations moved through the void with choreographed precision, each vessel a note in the symphony of conquest that Horus conducted with unconscious mastery. The War Master stood silhouetted against that cosmic fire, his presence filling the chamber with gravitational certainty that made lesser mortals straighten their spines and speak in hushed reverence. Alpharius approached through corridors that hummed with the controlled chaos of a fleet between campaigns, but the Cabal's visions still burned in his mind like acid eating through certainty. Two futures stretched before him. One where the Emperor's triumph led to 10 millennia of stagnation and suffering. Another where Horus's swift victory burned out Chaos's influence forever. The weight of that knowledge sat on his shoulders like a mountain of unburied dead, making each step toward his beloved brother feel like a march toward his own execution. "You've been avoiding the strategic councils," Horus said without turning, his reflection in the viewport showing eyes that had begun to burn with something that might have been ambition or desperation. "The other Primarchs wonder if the Alpha Legion has found more pressing battles to fight in the shadows." "We fight where we're most needed," Alpharius replied, the words carrying meanings that settled between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. "Not all victories require witnesses, and some truths are too dangerous for official records." Horus turned then, and Alpharius saw how the weight of supreme command had begun to etch new lines around those familiar features. The Golden Sun, who had once embodied the Great Crusade's highest ideals, now carried himself like a man who had glimpsed the abyss and found it reflecting his own face back at him with patient malevolence. "Do you ever wonder what Father truly intends for us when this is over?" Horus asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that would not carry beyond the viewport's alcove. "The Great Crusade nears its end. The galaxy bends to Imperial will with each passing day. But what becomes of weapons when there are no more wars to fight?" The question struck like shrapnel between ceramite plates. Alpharius had been wrestling with the same doubt, since the Cabal's terrible visions had shown him futures where the Emperor's victory became humanity's damnation. Yet hearing it from Horus's lips gave the uncertainty a weight that threatened to crush everything he had believed about their purpose and place in the cosmic order. "We are more than weapons," he said, though the words tasted like ash even as he spoke them. "Are we?" Horus moved closer, his charisma filling the space like the warmth of a forge fire. "I have seen the preliminary plans, brother. The bureaucrats circle like carrion birds, preparing to divide the galaxy into administrative sectors. They speak of governors and tax collectors, of trade routes and agricultural quotas and peaceful succession protocols. Where in their golden vision do they have need for Primarchs?" They walked together through trophy halls where banners from 100 compliant worlds hung in silent testimony to their shared victories. Mortals paused in their duties as the War Master passed, their eyes shining with devotion that was both genuine and carefully cultivated. Horus acknowledged each with the perfect gesture. A nod here, a word of encouragement there. The theatre of command performed with such sincerity that it became indistinguishable from truth. "Perhaps that is the point," Alpharius ventured, testing the waters while the Cabal's prophecies whispered in his mind. "To build something that no longer needs us. To create a peace so perfect that war becomes obsolete." "Noble words," Horus replied, but his smile carried no warmth. "Easy to speak when you command a legion that thrives in shadows and secrets. The Alpha Legion will always find purpose in the spaces between official documents. But what of the rest of us? What becomes of the lunar wolves when there are no more wolves left to hunt?" The conversation continued as they moved deeper into the ship's heart, past training chambers where Astartes practiced forms of warfare that might soon become museum pieces. Alpharius found himself studying his brother's profile, seeing how ambition and legitimate grievance had begun to war behind those noble features. The Cabal's visions had shown him this exact moment, the seeds of corruption taking root in the fertile soil of wounded pride and genuine concern for their legion's future. "I have been approached," Horus said suddenly, his voice barely audible above the ship's ambient sounds, "by those who claim to offer alternatives to Father's vision of peaceful administration. They speak of humanity's potential unleashed rather than constrained, of strength determining worth rather than bureaucratic position or political convenience." Alpharius felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, sharper than any blade forged in the armories of Mars, and he knew with terrible clarity that his response would echo across the galaxy's future like the first note of a funeral dirge. The Cabal's prophecy unfolded before him like a map written in the blood of unborn billions. This was the crossroads where loyalty and betrayal first learned to speak each other's names. "What do you think of such offers?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, despite the cosmic weight pressing down on his soul. "I think," Horus said, stopping before a viewing port that showed the distant gleam of terror like a golden eye watching from the dark, "that Father may have taught us too well the art of necessary sacrifice. He showed us that sometimes the greatest service requires the most terrible choices, that love itself can demand acts that history will never understand or forgive." The words hung between them, like a blade suspended over everything they had built together across decades of shared brotherhood and mutual respect. Alpharius saw the path stretching ahead with prophetic clarity. The corruption, the civil war, brothers killing brothers while the galaxy burned in the name of competing visions of humanity's destiny. Yet the Cabal's visions had shown him that this path, terrible as it promised to be, might represent the only route to true salvation. "Whatever you decide," he said finally, choosing each word with the precision of a sniper selecting targets, "know that the Alpha Legion stands with you. We understand better than most the burden of choices that serve the greater good through necessary evil." Horus turned to study his brother's face, with eyes that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone, to examine the soul beneath. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decisions not yet made, but already felt in the marrow of his bones, like the first tremors of an earthquake that would reshape continents. "Then perhaps it is time to teach the galaxy what we have learned about the true price of lasting peace." In the silence that followed, Alpharius felt the cosmic irony settling around them like a funeral shroud woven from starlight and shadow. To save his brother, he would have to help damn him. To preserve humanity's future, he would have to aid in its temporary destruction. The serpent had begun the long, agonizing process of devouring its own tail, and there would be no turning back from this feast of necessity and love transformed into betrayal. The strategium of the Alpha had become a cathedral of contradictions, its hololithic displays casting serpentine shadows that writhed across walls lined with tactical assessments that pulled in 17 different directions simultaneously. Alpharius stood at the chamber's heart, watching probability matrices shift like oil on water, while the weight of impossible choices pressed down on his shoulders like the gravity of a dying star. Around him, his most trusted commanders waited in the spaces between certainty and doubt, their faces bearing the hollow-eyed exhaustion of warriors who had begun to question the very nature of victory. The air itself seemed thick with deception, carrying the metallic taste of plans written in languages that had no words for truth. On the central display, operation files flickered between classifications that existed nowhere in Imperial doctrine. Janus Protocol promised swift compliance through engineered scarcity and targeted relief, while Ashen Garden demanded patient cultivation across generations, seeds of loyalty watered by gratitude that never learned it had been manufactured. Both bore his signature. Both claimed Primarch authority. Both served the same ultimate goal, while pulling toward opposite horizons. The contradictions are spreading through the Legion like a virus, reported Captain Kell, his voice carrying undertones of something that might have been fear. Data slates bearing the Hydra's seal contained orders that made tactical sense individually, but became paradoxes when viewed as a whole. Brother Sergeant Vex requests clarification on Thessian Tertius. His cell received acceleration protocols, while Brother Captain Score's unit was ordered to maintain operational security that requires complete mission isolation. Alfarius nodded, feeling the cosmic irony settle around him, like a funeral shroud woven from starlight and shadow. The Cabal's visions had shown him futures where victory and defeat became meaningless distinctions, but they had not prepared him for the weight of leading warriors toward a destiny that required betraying everything they had been trained to protect. How could he explain to these loyal sons that their greatest service might require their greatest treachery? Light years away, on the forge moon of Vespera 9, Brother Sergeant Vex moved through manufactorums that hummed with the rhythm of a civilization that believed itself free. The air tasted of recycled oxygen and industrial lubricants, but underneath lay the metallic tang of deception so complete it had become indistinguishable from truth. His kill team executed Janus Protocol with mechanical precision. Engineered shortages followed by timely relief. Gratitude manufactured with the same efficiency as the bolter shells that lined the moon's armories. Relief Node 12 is operational, Sister Null reported, her mortal voice roughened by months of sleeping between machines. Crowd density exceeds projections, emotion indices trending toward trust. Above them, in the retinal scorch of the smog-lit sky, a different shadow moved. Operative Licks led Cell Orphic through coolant tunnels blue as drowned lungs, their orders bearing authentication codes that verified as genuine, while demanding operational security so absolute it required them to treat all other Imperial forces as potential hostiles. Ashen Garden protocols called for patience, managed uncertainty, a careful cultivation of doubt that would bloom into petition only after the soil had been turned deep enough. False flag raiders sweep the district in 7 minutes, Lix whispered into encrypted channels. Minimal casualties, maximum rumour. We need a silent curfew by week's end. The two operations converged on Relief Node 12 like storm fronts meeting over a city that had never learned to read the sky. Vex's team deployed thermal coils and portable lumens, while the crowd breathed out its fear in visible clouds of vapor. An old woman touched the sigil of a humanitarian guild that existed only in carefully forged documents, her reverent fingertips tracing paint that might bless her grandchildren's lungs. Then the lights died, not cleanly, but with the heavy sigh of systems losing a fight they had never been warned they were fighting. Shadows climbed the walls like floodwater, while a child's shriek cut through the darkness, thin and sharp as spun wire. Lix's cell moved with textbook precision, blanks rattling the metal while smokes deployed to send fear curling through the crowd's underbelly without breaking bone. Vex saw muzzle flashes and did not know they were blanks. Training had never allowed for the premise that the threat might be their own reflection, with its visor turned opaque. He dropped his relief supplies and went to ground, while Caney barked ranges and their augers choked on aerosolized coolants and scripted chaos. Contacts, upper gantry, Caney reported. Pattern irregular. Friend or foe returns corrupted. Fire for effect, Vex ordered. Choosing speed over precision because hesitation killed and certainty had not attended the briefing. Bolter fire rolled through the relief node like thunder bursting from summer sky. Lix's forward partner jerked as real ammunition answered his blank with a stupid little cough, dead before his body knew how to fall. Sister Null turned toward the noise and became a silhouette against dying lumens, hands still open in offering, mouth forming words that would never reach their period. The round that found her came from nowhere and everywhere, an equation that balanced without caring how it was solved. Vex reached her side before knowing he had moved, cradling a mortal asset, whose name the Legion had trained out of her, but whose death his memory insisted upon restoring. She tried to speak about children drawing eagles and serpents side by side, but the sentence wandered into darkness and never came home. When it was over, metrics ticked toward green on distant displays. The curfew had been born, and the petition drafted exactly as planned. Yet in the strategium of the Alpha, Alfarius watched Vespera 9 flicker between classifications like a wound beneath sutures, knowing that the Hydra had learned the taste of its own blood. The serpent had begun to devour its tail, and there would be no turning back from this feast of necessity disguised as brotherhood. The ash plains of Istvan V stretched beneath a sky the colour of dried blood, where volcanic glass crunched underfoot like the bones of dead civilizations. The air tasted of cordite and betrayal, thick with the promise of atrocities yet to unfold across terrain that had been transformed into a killing ground by careful preparation and patient deception. In the distance, drop pods fell like burning tears from the bellies of loyalist ships, carrying warriors who still believed in brotherhood and honor toward a fate orchestrated by the very forces they trusted most. Alfarius stood on a ridge of obsidian that jutted from the wasteland like a blade thrust through reality's skin, watching friendly markers move across his tactical display with the weight of cosmic irony pressing down on his shoulders. The Cabal's visions whispered in his mind, showing him futures where this moment of treachery saved humanity from 10 millennia of stagnation, where the Emperor's victory became the instrument of everything they had sworn to protect against. Yet the knowledge felt like poison in his veins as he watched the Iron Hands establish their perimeter, the Raven Guard deploy their reconnaissance screens, the Salamanders form protective cordons around their heavy equipment. Second wave inbound, reported Captain Kell, his voice carrying the hollow quality of a man who had learned to speak while his soul was bleeding. Loyalist forces achieving primary objectives ahead of schedule. They're requesting confirmation of support protocols. The words hung in the recycled air of his command center like incense from a funeral pyre. Alfarius studied the tactical projections, watching as warriors who had stood beside his legion in 100 campaigns moved through killing fields that had been prepared with surgical precision. Each marker represented brothers who had shared rations and ammunition, and the bitter jokes that made war bearable, now walking unknowingly toward their own execution. "Confirm support protocols," he replied, the lie feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "All units maintain operational readiness." Light years away in the ash-choked valleys below, Brother Sergeant Vex moved through terrain that had been transformed into a maze of interlocking fire zones and carefully prepared ambush sites. The psychological conditioning that had made Thessian Tertius possible now worked against him. Training that insisted Imperial forces were allies warring with evidence that they were about to become something else entirely. Around him, His kill team executed their assigned positions with mechanical precision, each warrior carrying the weight of knowledge that felt heavier than their ceramite armor. Raven Guard advancing on grid Tertia 7, Sister Null reported, her mortal voice roughened by months of breathing recycled air and swallowing necessary lies. Salamanders forming shield wall along the thermal vents, iron hands pushing hard for the canyon mouth. The second wave descended like Judgment Day, compressed into metal and fire. Drop pods screamed through atmosphere thick with volcanic ash, their retro thrusters carving scars through glassed basalt, as the traitor legions fell alongside those who still believed the word loyalty meant something unbreakable. For 17 minutes, the charade continued. Voxnets meshed, banners recognized and returned, brothers greeting brothers with the casual affection of shared purpose. Then came the signal. It arrived not as words, but as a shift in the electromagnetic spectrum, a change in transponder frequencies that felt like the moment between heartbeats when the body realizes it is dying. IFF markers flipped from friend to prey with the efficiency of a blade drawn across a throat. The first shots were surgical rather than symbolic. Heavy weapons selecting command nodes, apothecaries, vox hubs, the critical infrastructure that held armies together. Vex watched a Raven Guard captain, a warrior he had trained beside on the killing fields of Ulanor, raise his bolter toward an Iron Warrior's position that had suddenly begun painting targeting solutions on loyalist forces. The captain's confusion lasted exactly long enough for a round from Vex's own weapon to find the gap between helmet and gorget, ending questions that could never be answered, and doubts that served no tactical purpose. The massacre unfolded with choreographed precision, each death carefully orchestrated to serve prophecies that promised salvation through damnation. The Alpha Legion moved through their assigned sectors like ghosts of their former selves, stripping identification from the dead, while planting evidence that would implicate forces that had never existed in atrocities they had never committed. History was being rewritten in real time, truth buried beneath layers of deception so complex that even they would eventually forget which lies they had told. In a crater that still glowed with the heat of a fusion reactor's death, Captain Kell found himself face to face with a salamander who had shared a drink with him after the compliance of Xerxes Prime. The loyalist's eyes reflected something that transcended mere shock, a recognition that the universe had fundamentally changed, that concepts like honor and brotherhood had become obsolete in the space between one heartbeat and the next. "Why?" the salamander asked, the word carved from horror and disbelief. Kell thought of the Cabal's visions, of futures where the Emperor's triumph led to 10,000 years of stagnation, while chaos fed on humanity's despair. He thought of children drawing eagles wrapped in serpents' coils, of Sister Null's open hands and the way light died in manufactured relief centers. He thought of love expressed through betrayal and loyalty that required the greatest treachery. "Because someone has to carry the weight," he whispered, then pulled the trigger. As the sun set over Istvan V, painting the ash fields in shades of amber and gold that made the carnage look almost beautiful, the Hydra completed its first taste of its own tail. The serpent had learned that salvation might require damnation, that the greatest service could demand the most terrible sacrifice. In the silence that followed, only the wind moved through the killing fields, carrying whispers of ash and newer lies toward a future that would never forgive them for the choice they had made in its name. The silence that followed Istvan V was not the peace of victory, but the hollow quiet of a graveyard where the dead refused to stay buried. In the strategium of the Alpha, where hololithic displays cast serpentine shadows across walls that had witnessed the planning of bloodless conquests, Alfaria stood before tactical projections that no longer made sense. Each data stream carried authentication codes that verified as genuine, while contradicting every other directive with mathematical precision, creating a web of orders that pulled the Legion in 17 different directions simultaneously. Cell Omega-7 reports successful infiltration of Loyalist supply depot in Segmentum Solar. Omegan's voice emerged from the communication array, carrying undertones of confusion that made reality shiver. They have disrupted Imperial logistics and planted evidence suggesting traitor movements toward the Cygnus front. Before Alfarius could respond, another transmission cut through the encrypted channels like a blade drawn across silk. Cell Alpha 13 reports successful defense of that same supply depot against saboteurs bearing Alpha Legion signatures. 3 hostiles neutralized. All carried genuine Legion authentication codes. The words hung in the recycled air like poison gas. Alfarius studied the verification matrices, watching as both reports authenticated through systems designed to be incorruptible. The Hydra was learning to hunt itself, and in that cannibalistic feast lay the seeds of something that transcended mere tactical confusion and approached genuine madness. Light years away, on the industrial moon of Mordian Tertius, where manufactorums hummed with the rhythm of a civilization that believed itself free, Brother Sergeant Vex moved through corridors that tasted of recycled oxygen and betrayal. His orders had been precise. Eliminate remaining Loyalist elements and secure intelligence caches. Yet the intelligence he had discovered made his blood run cold as the void between stars. The bunker's blast doors had been breached from within, their adamantine surfaces bearing the distinctive burn patterns of Alpha Legion plasma charges. Inside, 3 figures in Legion colors knelt over tactical displays that showed deployment patterns Vex recognized as his own unit's operational signatures from 6 months prior. Their armor bore the correct markings, their weapons carried the proper benedictions, their movements spoke of training that could only have come from Legion instructors. Identify yourselves, Vex commanded, his bolt pistol trained on the central figure, whose helmet reflected no light despite the bunker's harsh illumination. We are what you made us, came the reply, spoken in a voice that carried harmonics of certainty that made the air taste of copper and dying light. We are the Alpha Legion that serves the true vision, uncorrupted by doubt or the weakness of mortal conscience. The firefight erupted without warning, muzzle flashes strobing through the industrial gloom like lightning captured in amber. These were not infiltrators wearing stolen colors, but Alpha Legion operatives who moved with tactical precision that spoke of genuine training. Yet something in their presence made reality bend around the edges. They fought with the mechanical efficiency of warriors who had forgotten why victory mattered, only that it must be achieved. When the silence returned, Vex knelt beside corpses whose gene seed had been drawn from the same source as his own. Their blood looked exactly like his blood. Their armor bore the same scars from the same campaigns. Yet clutched in the gauntlet of the fallen squad leader, he found something that made his soul recoil. A crude icon carved from what might have been bone, depicting a horned figure whose maw dripped with stars that seemed to move when observed directly. The realization struck like shrapnel between ceramite plates. This was not mere tactical disagreement or operational confusion. This was evidence of corruption that went deeper than conflicting orders or philosophical differences. Some cells of the Alpha Legion had been changed by influences that understood their methods well enough to perfect them. stripping away the humanity that had once made their deceptions serve a greater purpose. In the strategium of the Alpha, watching similar reports filter in from a dozen worlds where brother had killed brother, while both sides claimed loyalty to the same cause, Alfarius felt the weight of cosmic irony settling around him like a funeral shroud. The Cabal's visions had shown him futures where calculated betrayal might save humanity from 10 millennia of stagnation, but they had not prepared him for the possibility that his legion's mastery of deception would make them vulnerable to deception in return. "We're losing control of our own narrative," Omegan observed, his reflection in the observation port showing features that might have belonged to either twin. "The cells are fragmenting along lines we never drew, following interpretations of orders we never issued." The tactical displays flickered with reports of Alpha Legion forces engaging each other across the galaxy, each side certain they represented the true Legion, while their opponents had been corrupted by influences they could not name. Authentication codes that should have prevented such confusion instead became weapons in their own right, genuine authority twisted into authorization for fratricide. "The Hydra questions the taste of its own tail," Alfarius whispered, staring at casualty reports that bore the names of warriors he had personally trained, "and finds the flavor familiar." In that moment of terrible clarity, both twins understood that they had become pieces in a game whose rules they did not comprehend. Played by forces that had been watching from the spaces between stars since before humanity learned to count its own heartbeats. The serpent had begun to devour itself, and the consumption had taken forms that defied every contingency they had planned for in their careful orchestration of necessary betrayal. The Alpha Legion was becoming something new, and none of them could be certain whether that transformation served the Emperor's vision, the Cabal's prophecy, or something far older and more patient that had been waiting for this moment when doubt finally found purchase in a Primarch's heart and grew into the cancer that would consume them all. The shrine on Mordian Tertius had become a monument to forgotten names, its walls lined with votive candles that cast dancing shadows across icons whose faces seemed to shift when observed directly. Brother Sergeant Vex moved through the sacred space like a hunter tracking wounded prey, his auger readings painting the air with electromagnetic ghosts that spoke of presences that should not exist. The crude bone token he had recovered from the fallen Alpha Legion operative pulsed with energies that made reality bend around the edges, its carved surface depicting symbols that hurt to perceive clearly. In the shrine's deepest alcove, where incense smoke gathered like the breath of dying gods, he found what he had been hunting. The figure knelt before a makeshift altar, his ceramide bearing the unremarkable colours of a Legion scout, helm removed to reveal features that carried the unsettling quality common to all Alpha Legion operatives, perfectly familiar yet somehow wrong, as if reality itself couldn't decide who he truly was. "Identify yourself," Vex commanded, bolt pistol trained on the kneeling figure, whose hands moved in patterns that spoke prayers in languages that predated human speech. The operative turned slowly, his smile carrying the exact weight to suggest candor without admitting anything. Around him, scattered like offerings, lay a collection of masks and identity tokens, the insignia of a naval provost, the bronze visor of a Sons of Horus sergeant, the plain ceramite of an unremarkable scout. Each represented the life lived, an identity worn until the lines between truth and performance had dissolved entirely. "I am Alfarius," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the candle flames lean away from his words. "So are you, so are we all, until the masks teach us to forget the faces beneath." They fought like brothers who had shared instruction and nightmares, each movement a catechism of survival recited in reverse. Bolter, blade, elbow, the familiar dance of Astartes combat performed in a space too small for such violence. Vex cut the operative's cheekbone and watched blood that looked precisely like his own spill onto consecrated stone. "Who issued your last orders?" Vex demanded, tracking his weapon over laboured breathing. The answer came from too many directions at once, as if the shrine itself had learned to speak. Omegon, Alpharius, a council older than stars, the voice you hear when you lie to sleep and convince yourself you are a necessary evil. In that moment of terrible clarity, Vex understood what they were facing. This was not mere tactical confusion or philosophical disagreement. This was evidence of corruption that went deeper than conflicting orders or operational security. The operative's eyes reflected something that transcended human consciousness, an intelligence that had learned their methods well enough to perfect them, while stripping away the humanity that had once made their deceptions serve a greater purpose. Light years away, in the strategium of the Alpha, where hololithic displays cast serpentine shadows across walls that had witnessed the planning of bloodless conquests, Omegon watched similar reports filter in from across the galaxy. Each data stream carried authentication codes that verified as genuine, while contradicting every other directive with mathematical precision, creating a web of orders that pulled the Legion in 17 different directions simultaneously. Cell Omega-7 reports successful infiltration of Loyalist supply depot in Segmentum Solar. Came one transmission, bearing his own cipher. Cell Alpha-13 reports successful defense of that same depot against saboteurs bearing genuine Legion signatures. Followed another, authenticated through systems designed to be incorruptible. The Hydra was learning to hunt itself, and in that cannibalistic feast lay evidence of manipulation by forces that understood their nature better than they understood themselves. On Xerxes Prime, embedded operatives who had worn Loyalist colours for decades were executing directives that demanded not merely the feigning of chaos worship, but its active cultivation. Philosophical groups they had spent years nurturing as plausible scapegoats were being transformed into genuine cults, their manufactured evidence of corruption becoming sickeningly real. "They've turned our methods against us," Alpharius observed, his hololithic projection flickering with interference that tasted of copper and dying light. "Our agents, so accustomed to living lies, are now living the lie. The enemy has learned our language, brother. They speak in riddles and paradoxes, just like us." In the shrine on Mordian Tertius, surrounded by the detritus of abandoned identities, Vex knelt beside the fallen operative, whose breath came in rattling gasps. The bone token lay between them like a confession carved from nightmare, its surface crawling with symbols that seemed to move when perceived directly. "What did you let in?" Vex asked, though the answer hung in the recycled air like the weight of a fallen bell. "A lie that learned to live," the operative whispered, his voice carrying undertones of horror that made the shrine's icons weep candle wax. "A mask that wanted a face. It called itself a friend of necessary ends. It told me the Emperor hated me, that Horus loved me, that Alpharius was only me when I wore him well. He laughed, small and terrible. It used my oath to walk through our sanctuaries of secrecy. The candles guttered as if pinched by invisible fingers, plunging the shrine into darkness that felt thick enough to drown in. In that absolute black, Vex felt more than heard the Hydra's heads turning upon one another, the scrape of scales against scales, as the serpent learned a hunger it could not satisfy. Across the galaxy, Alpha Legion forces engaged each other while both sides claimed loyalty to causes they could no longer clearly define, each cell finding evidence of corruption in every other cell, while remaining blind to the changes occurring within their own ranks. The realization struck like shrapnel between ceramite plates. The Alpha Legion's mastery of deception, their willingness to embrace moral ambiguity for the greater good, had made them the perfect conduits for a more ancient, more insidious form of manipulation. Their operatives, so accustomed to wearing masks that they had forgotten the faces beneath, were now being molded by unseen hands that understood that the greatest victories came not through conquest, but through corruption from within. The Hydra stared into a mirror and found the warp looking back, smiling with their smile, speaking with their voice, using their own methods to transform them into weapons pointed at themselves. The serpent had begun to devour its own tail, and the taste was familiar enough to hunger for more. In the returning silence, surrounded by the scattered remnants of identities that had never been real, and the growing awareness that their greatest strength had become their fatal weakness, the Alpha Legion faced the terrible possibility that they were no longer the architects of their own deception, but merely instruments in a game whose rules they had never understood. The enemy had learned to wear their face, and now they could no longer tell which reflection was truly their own. The coordinates led to a place that existed in no Imperial record, a hollowed asteroid drifting in the shadow of Jupiter's great red eye, where storms older than human civilization raged in patterns that hurt to observe directly. The Alpha's cutter slipped through debris fields that had once been mining stations, their twisted remains serving as monuments to secrets that had required the silence of entire populations to maintain. Here, where the solar wind carried whispers of ancient conspiracies and the void itself seemed to listen, Omegon prepared to meet the architect of truths too dangerous for even Primarchs to comprehend. The chamber carved from the asteroid's heart bore no resemblance to Imperial architecture, its walls flowing like frozen water around crystalline formations that pulsed with their own inner light. The air tasted of ozone and parchment, of knowledge that had fermented in darkness until it became something that could poison minds simply through proximity. When Malkador the Sigillite materialized from shadows that seemed deeper than mere absence of light, his presence filled the space not with authority, but with the patient weight of mountains that had learned to think. "You have come seeking answers to questions you fear to voice," Malkador observed, his ancient features bearing the accumulated weight of 30 millennia spent in service to truths that could shatter civilizations. Around him, hololithic displays flickered into existence, showing tactical projections that painted the Alpha Legion's current disposition across the galaxy, each marker representing cells that hunted each other through shadows that had grown deep enough to hide genuine monsters. "The Legion, fragments," Omegon said, his voice carrying harmonics of uncertainty that made the crystalline walls resonate like struck bells. "We turn upon ourselves, while both sides claim loyalty to causes we can no longer define. Our own methods have been turned against us by forces that understand our nature better than we understand ourselves." Malkador's smile contained no warmth, only the terrible compassion of someone who had watched the rise and fall of species while serving purposes that transcended individual suffering. The serpent questions the taste of its own tail and finds the flavor familiar. "Yet you have not come here to report tactical difficulties, have you, Omegon? You have come because you suspect the scope of the game in which you have been playing." The words struck like shrapnel between ceramite plates. Omegon felt reality shift around him as implications cascaded through his consciousness like dominoes, falling in patterns that had been arranged by hands he was only beginning to recognize. The careful orchestration of their betrayal, the philosophical weight of choosing between two forms of damnation, the terrible certainty that their sacrifice might save humanity. All of it suddenly felt like performance in a theatre where the audience had written the script. The Cabal's visions, he whispered. Watching hololithic displays show the branching timelines that had driven them toward their current path. The choice between the Emperor's slow death and Horus's swift victory. You knew what they would show us. I knew what they needed you to see, Malkador corrected, his gnarled fingers manipulating data streams that showed authentication codes bleeding through the Legion's command structure, like poison in a water supply. The Cabal sees threads of fate, but they do not weave the tapestry. They merely interpret patterns that have already been laid, and often they see only what serves their own understanding of necessity. The chamber's displays shifted, showing reports from Mordian Tertius, where bone tokens carved with symbols that hurt to perceive had been found clutched in the gauntlets of Alpha Legion operatives who had died fighting their own brothers. Other projections revealed similar evidence from across the galaxy, shrines to powers that fed on deception itself, agents so accustomed to living lies that they had become conduits for influences that understood their methods well enough to perfect them. Your legion was chosen precisely because of your capacity for moral flexibility, Malkador continued, his voice carrying undertones that bypassed rational thought and resonated in the bones of those who heard it. The forces that whisper in the spaces between stars needed servants who could be convinced that betrayal served loyalty, that damnation might be salvation. They found in the Alpha Legion the perfect instruments for corruption that would appear as virtue. The revelations settled around Omegon, like a funeral shroud woven from starlight and shadow. Every sacrifice, every calculated atrocity, every lie he and Alfarius had woven into the fabric of the galaxy. All of it had been orchestrated by influences that had been watching from the darkness since before humanity learned to count its own heartbeats. Their betrayal, their very damnation, had been guided by hands that understood that the greatest victories came not through conquest, but through corruption from within. Then what are we? Omegon asked, his voice barely audible above the chamber's psychic resonance. Loyalists who serve through betrayal? Traitors who damn themselves for salvation? Pawns in a game whose rules we never learned? Malkador's eyes reflected depths that spoke of knowledge accumulated across spans of time that made mortal lifespans seem like heartbeats. You are what you have always been, the Alpha Legion. The question is whether you will choose to remain instruments of others' designs or reclaim agency over your own fate. The silence that followed carried the weight of cosmic responsibility, the terrible burden of choice in a universe where every path led through necessary evil toward uncertain redemption. In the hololithic displays, the Alpha Legion's fragmentation continued to spread like cancer through the galaxy's body, each cell convinced it served the greater good, while destroying everything it had been created to protect. The Emperor plays a long game, Malkador said finally, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of decisions made before the stars had learned their current names. One whose pieces move across millennia, whose stakes are the very soul of mankind. Your part in that game was always going to require choices that history would never understand or forgive. In the darkness between Jupiter's storms, surrounded by the accumulated weight of conspiracies that spanned galaxies and the growing awareness that their greatest strength had become their fatal weakness, Omegon faced the terrible possibility that their loyalty had always been measured not by their obedience, but by their willingness to be damned in service to truths too large for individual comprehension. The Hydra had learned the taste of its own tail, and now it faced the choice between continuing to devour itself according to scripts written by alien hands, or choosing to bite through the patterns that bound it towards something that might transcend the comfortable certainty of necessary evil. In the returning silence, only the whisper of ancient conspiracies moved through passages that connected to depths where even the Emperor's light struggled to reach, carrying implications that would echo across the galaxy's future, like the first notes of a funeral dirge that had been composed before the first human had ever looked up at the stars and wondered what watched them in return. Pluto hung at the edge of Sol like a wound that had learned to keep its own secrets, the dwarf world's surface scarred by orbital bombardments that painted craters across ice older than human memory. The void around the fortress moon glittered with the debris of shattered loyalties, fragments of ceramite and adamantium that had once been ships bearing the Aquila with pride, now reduced to frozen monuments of brotherhood betrayed. Here, where the Emperor's light struggled to reach and shadows gathered like conspirators around a deathbed, the Alpha Legion prepared to wage war against the very concept of certainty itself. The Alpha drifted through minefields that had been laid by hands that understood the geometry of deception, her hull bearing scars from battles that existed in no official record. In the ship's command chamber, where hololithic displays cast serpentine shadows across walls lined with tactical assessments that contradicted themselves with mathematical precision, Alpharius watched the Imperial fists advance with the inexorable certainty of sunrise. Each golden marker represented warriors whose unwavering loyalty had become the measuring stick against which all other virtues were weighed, sons of dawn who moved through the void like prayers made manifest in ceramite and steel. Primary assault wave achieving breakthrough at Grid Tertius 7, reported Captain Kell, his voice carrying the hollow quality of a man who had learned to speak while his soul was bleeding. Imperial fists advancing in textbook formation. Our defensive positions are responding as programmed. The words hung in the recycled air like incense from a funeral pyre. Alpharius studied the tactical projections, watching as his own forces executed maneuvers that served multiple contradictory purposes simultaneously. They defended positions while secretly sabotaging their own defensive systems, held ground while ensuring it could not be held, killed Imperial fists while arranging for their own defeats with surgical precision. Light years away in the fortress moon's deepest tunnels, where the air tasted of recycled oxygen and betrayal, Brother Sergeant Vex led his kill team through passages carved from living rock by hands that understood the architecture of necessary evil. Their orders had been precise yet paradoxical. Eliminate Imperial fist penetration while ensuring the fortress fell. Preserve critical intelligence while guaranteeing its capture. Die with honor while living with the knowledge that their sacrifice served purposes they could not name. Breach at Junction Tertius, Sister Null reported, her mortal voice roughened by months of breathing recycled air and swallowing necessary lies. Imperial fists advancing in force, but we're also receiving fire from Grid 7-7. IFF reads, Alpha Legion signatures. The firefight erupted without ceremony, muzzle flashes strobing through industrial gloom like lightning captured in amber. But this was not the clean violence of honest warfare. This was the confused slaughter of brothers who no longer recognized their own reflection. Vex found himself caught between Imperial fists advancing from the north and Alpha Legion operatives firing from positions they were supposed to be defending, each side certain they served the greater good, while destroying everything they had been created to protect. Cell Omega-7 reports successful defense of the primary reactor came one transmission, bearing authentication codes that verified as genuine. Cell Alpha-13 reports successful sabotage of that same reactor, followed another, authenticated through systems designed to be incorruptible. The Hydra was learning to hunt itself with increasing efficiency, and in that cannibalistic feast lay evidence of manipulation by forces that understood their nature better than they understood themselves. In the command chamber of the Alpha, watching casualty reports stream across displays that painted his legion's disposition in shades of necessary sacrifice, Alpharius felt the weight of Malcador's revelations settling around him like a funeral shroud. The Cabal's visions had shown him futures where calculated betrayal might save humanity from 10 millennia of stagnation, but they had not prepared him for the possibility that his legion's mastery of deception would make them vulnerable to deception in return. "We're losing more warriors to ourselves than to the enemy," Omegan observed, his hololithic projection flickering with interference that tasted of copper and dying light. "The cells are fragmenting along lines we never drew, following interpretations of orders we never issued. Some carry bone tokens carved with symbols that hurt to perceive directly." The tactical displays showed the grim mathematics of fratricidal warfare. Alpha Legion forces engaged each other across 17 sectors, while both sides claimed loyalty to causes they could no longer clearly define. Authentication codes that should have prevented such confusion had instead become weapons in their own right. Genuine authority twisted into authorization for self-destruction on a scale that defied every contingency they had planned for. "The serpent questions the taste of its own tail," Alpharius whispered, staring at casualty reports that bore the names of warriors he had personally trained, "and finds the flavor familiar enough to hunger for more." As Pluto's fortress moon shuddered under bombardments that served purposes pulling in contradictory directions, the Alpha Legion faced the terrible possibility that their greatest strength had become their fatal weakness. Their operatives, so accustomed to wearing masks that they had forgotten the faces beneath, were now being molded by unseen hands that understood that the greatest victories came not through conquest, but through corruption from within. The realization struck like shrapnel between ceramite plates. If deception bred only stronger prisons, if their methods had been turned against them by forces that spoke in riddles and paradoxes just like them, then perhaps the time had come to choose a different weapon entirely. The most dangerous thing the Alpha Legion could do was exactly what no one expected: tell the truth. "Open a channel to the phalanx," Alpharius commanded, his voice carrying harmonics of decision that made the command chamber's air taste of ozone and finality. "Request direct communication with Rogel Dawn. No codes, no intermediaries, no masks." The words carried the weight of cosmic responsibility, the terrible burden of choice in a universe where every path led through necessary evil toward uncertain redemption. The Hydra had learned the taste of its own blood and found it bitter, but perhaps in that bitterness lay the seed of something that might transcend the comfortable certainty of deception disguised as virtue. In the silence that followed, surrounded by the accumulated weight of conspiracies that spanned galaxies, and the growing awareness that their greatest victory might require their most complete defeat, Alpharius prepared to shed the serpent's skin and reveal the face beneath, whatever the cost. The time for shadows was ending. The time for truth, terrible and naked and sharp as any blade, had begun. Terror burned like a wound that had learned to weep stars, its orbital defenses flaring and dying in patterns that spoke of civilizations ending not with bang or whimper, but with the slow, inexorable grinding of brother against brother. The Alpha drifted through debris fields that had once been mining stations, their twisted remains serving as monuments to loyalties that had become obsolete in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Here, where the Emperor's light struggled to reach and shadows gathered like conspirators around a deathbed, the communication array crackled with the weight of truths too dangerous for even Primarchs to comprehend. Rogel Dawn's image materialized in the chamber's heart with the gravitational certainty of mountains that had learned to judge, his presence filling the space with architectural precision that made lesser concepts like doubt seem structurally unsound. Behind him, the bridge of the phalanx stretched like a monument to imperial certainty, its golden surfaces reflecting light that seemed to emanate from the Primarch himself, with the steady radiance of stars that had never learned to question their own burning. "You requested this communication," Dawn said, his voice carrying the weight of fortresses built from concepts like honor and duty. "I confess surprise that the Alpha Legion chooses direct engagement over shadows and whispers." Alpharius stood before the projection, feeling the cosmic irony settling around him like armor forged from starlight and regret. The tactical displays surrounding them showed Pluto's fortress moon, shuddering under bombardments that served contradictory purposes, Alpha Legion forces fragmenting into cells that hunted each other, through passages carved from living rock by hands that understood the architecture of necessary evil. "Perhaps because shadows have begun to cast us," he replied, the words carrying harmonics that made reality shiver. "Tell me, brother, when you look at your reflection in polished ceramite, do you still recognize the face that stares back? Or do you see only the mask that duty has carved from flesh that once knew how to doubt?" Dawn's features shifted almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that spoke of questions he had been avoiding since Istvan V painted the galaxy in shades of fraternal blood. "I recognize my purpose, the oath sworn before the Emperor's throne, the burden of choices that serve the greater good regardless of personal cost. And if those choices were not your own?" Alpharius stepped closer, his image flickering with interference that tasted of copper and dying light. "If the very concepts of duty and honor had been shaped by forces that understood your nature well enough to perfect it?" "We have been played, Rogel. All of us. The Cabal showed us visions of two futures, your victory leading to 10 millennia of stagnation, or Horus's swift triumph burning out chaos before it could take permanent root. We chose betrayal to serve loyalty, damnation to achieve salvation." The silence that followed carried the weight of implications that could shatter empires. Dawn's image flickered as if reality itself struggled to maintain connection between brothers whose paths had diverged beyond any possibility of reconciliation. "You speak in riddles," Dawn observed, though his voice carried undertones of uncertainty that made the phalanx's bridge seem less solid than before. "As your legion always has." "That is the problem," Alpharius said, his reflection showing features that might have belonged to either twin or neither. "We became so skilled at deception that we made ourselves perfect conduits for deception in return. Our enemies learned our language, brother. They speak in riddles and paradoxes, just like us. The serpent has learned the taste of its own tail and finds the flavor familiar enough to hunger for more." "Then what do you propose?" Dawn asked, his voice carrying the weight of someone whose identity had been built from concepts now revealed as potentially hollow. "Perhaps the most dangerous thing we can do. Choose truth over deception, honest confrontation over necessary lies, Alpharius paused, watching casualty reports stream across displays that painted his legion's disposition in shades of fraternal blood. But I fear it may already be too late for such simple solutions. The channel cut with the finality of a blade drawn across silk. In the returning silence, Omegon stepped from shadows that seemed deeper than mere absence of light, his presence filling the space with the patient weight of questions that had learned to answer themselves. You would walk into dawn's certainty and call it truth, Omegon said, his voice carrying undertones of something that might have been pity. You would let his faith grind us into monuments to his refusal to bend. I would place one fact in a galaxy drowning in belief, Alpharius replied, staring at tactical projections that showed their legion fragmenting along lines they had never drawn. We have seen the Cabal's visions. We have felt the warp smile behind our methods. Malkador all but told us that our damnation was contingently useful. I would decide for once without invisible hands guiding my choices. Omegon moved closer, the air between them thin as old paper ready to tear. If you reveal yourself to Dawn, you give him everything he needs. You become the knife he sharpens his legend upon. We will be written in that blood for 10,000 years. Perhaps a clean story is the only blade left to us, Alpharius said, feeling the weight of cosmic responsibility pressing against his consciousness like the gravity of a dying star. Perhaps we must bleed into one truth so the Hydra stops feeding on itself. Or perhaps we finish the task required, Omegon countered, his conviction burning with the cold fire of stars that had learned to hate their own light. We ensure Horus's victory comes swift enough that the predators of the abyss starve before the feast becomes ritual. We extinguish ourselves in the same motion. Necessary sacrifice for necessary salvation. Necessary for whom? Alpharius whispered, and in those words lay the philosophical chasm that had been growing between them since the Cabal first whispered of futures written in the blood of unborn billions. The ship groaned, as if their conversation had acquired mass. Around them, the command chamber's displays showed reports from across the galaxy, where Alpha Legion forces engaged each other while both sides claimed loyalty to causes they could no longer clearly define. Authentication codes that should have prevented fratricidal warfare had instead become weapons authorizing self-destruction on an unprecedented scale. Then we divide, Omegon said finally, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that would echo across millennia. Clean lines, honest directives, no more riddles between our own. Let those who cannot bear the light come with me into shadows where purpose remains clear. Let those who cannot bear the dark follow you into whatever truth you think awaits. Light years compressed into acts of decision. Codes that had once blurred identity now parted like seas cut by blades forged from necessity and regret. On the muster decks, Brother Sergeant Vex stood amid warriors whose armor bore ash from Istvan and frost from Pluto's night side, reading two messages that arrived simultaneously, yet demanded the silence of the other to exist. The first carried the plain stamp of simple grammar and absolute choice. Legionaries of the Hydra, I go to end a narrative that has stolen our name. Stand down from fratricide. Converge on appointed vectors. We will present ourselves to dawn without masks. If I fall, let it be as boundary, not labyrinth. Alpharius. The second came like a hand extended in darkness. Sons of the last question, the window for swift fire narrows. Strike while the Warmaster's victory can still burn clean. If we must die, let it be as answer, not doubt. Omegon Vex read both, feeling all the ghosts in him breathe. He saw Sister Null's open hands, the Raven Guard captain's last look, the bone tokens that crawled when touched. Around him, helms clicked into place like verdicts. Some nodded toward Alpha's call, the promise of one hard truth. Others turned toward shadow, the comfort of motion that postponed judgment. "We split," he told his kill team, setting the messages side by side like relics on an altar of functional steel. Not as enemies, as consequences. In the strategium, the twins issued their last joint command, dividing assets by clarity rather than capability. Ships peeled from the Alpha's wake like scales shedding from a serpent's flank, some angling sunward toward unwavering fortresses, others slipping outward into bands of ghostlight where ambush lived and purpose remained unquestioned. "He will not believe," Omegon said, softer now, watching his brother's reflection in the observation dome. "He will believe exactly what he must," Alpharius answered, understanding that their conversation had become something more than tactical discussion. That is the function of walls. They did not embrace. They did not offer oaths. They had spent a lifetime speaking each other's names. There was nothing left to borrow. In the silence that followed, the Hydra learned to breathe with one lung in light and one in shadow, and for the first time since they were stolen by stars, the serpent chose to be two rather than one, wearing the mask of unity. The Alpha rolled, bringing terror into view like a wound seen through tears. Orders departed in paired spirals, twin helixes unwinding toward fates no prophecy had accounted for, because they had been made by brothers who finally chose to be themselves rather than instruments in games whose rules they had never learned. In that choosing lay either salvation or damnation, but for once it would be their own. The fortress moon of Pluto turned like a prayer wheel carved from ice and adamantium, its surface scarred by bombardments that had transformed ancient craters into killing fields, where the geometry of war met the architecture of necessity. In the void above, where debris from shattered loyalties drifted like frozen tears, a single craft approached the Imperial Fist defensive perimeter with the deliberate certainty of pilgrimage made manifest. The vessel bore no Hydra sigils, no serpentine deceptions, only the plain ceramite of honest intent moving through space that tasted of ozone and the promise of endings. Alpharius stood on the bridge of his commandeered transport, watching the phalanx resolve from distant star to golden monument through viewports that had been stripped of all tactical overlays save the most basic navigation data. Around him, Brother Sergeant Vex and his kill team maintained weapons discipline with the hollow precision of warriors who had finally learned the difference between necessary lies and comfortable ones. Their armor bore no legion markings, no identification beyond the scars earned in service to causes they could no longer clearly define. "Signal from the phalanx," reported Captain Kell, his voice carrying the weight of decisions that had transformed brothers into strangers. "Standard challenge protocols. They demand identification and statement of intent." "Tell them," Alpharius said, removing his helmet to reveal features that bore the unsettling quality common to all Alpha Legion operatives, yet somehow seemed more solid now, as if reality had finally decided who he truly was. "That Alpharius comes to end a narrative that has learned to write itself with our blood. No codes, no intermediaries, no masks." The transmission crackled across void space with the stark simplicity of truth finally spoken aloud. On the phalanx's command bridge, where golden light reflected from surfaces that had never known doubt, Rogel Dawn studied the approaching vessel through auger arrays that painted threat assessments in shades of confusion and growing certainty. Here was the architect of Istvan V's betrayal, the shadow who had orchestrated bloodless conquest across 100 worlds, approaching without the serpentine grace that had once marked his every movement. A trap within a trap within a trap, to his assembled captains, though the words carried no conviction. The Alpha Legion does not operate without layers of deception, yet the augurs detect no supporting elements, no hidden assets, no electromagnetic signatures that suggest anything beyond what we observe directly. The docking proceeded with mechanical precision, magnetic clamps engaging with the finality of choices made and accepted. Alpharius walked through corridors that hummed with the controlled certainty of warriors who had never learned to question their own foundation, his footsteps echoing against bulkheads polished to mirror brightness by the accumulated weight of unwavering faith. Imperial fists formed honor guards that were also firing squads, their weapons trained with disciplined restraint on a brother who had become something that transcended their understanding of how warfare was supposed to function. The confrontation chamber had been prepared according to ancient protocols, its walls bearing the heraldry of victories, won through strength of arms and clarity of purpose. Rogel Dawn waited at its center, not upon a dais or beneath banners, but on ground where equals met to settle questions that could not be resolved through intermediaries. His presence filled the space with gravitational certainty, the architectural precision that had built fortresses from concepts like honor and duty, made manifest in ceramite and flesh. "You come alone," Dawn observed, his voice carrying undertones of confusion that made reality shiver around the edges. "Without the shadows and whispers that have defined your legion since its inception. I confess uncertainty about how to interpret such directness." "Interpret it as what it is," Alpharius replied, stepping into the chamber's heart with movements that spoke of exhaustion rather than the calculated ambiguity that had once made him impossible to pin down. "The last honest thing I may ever do. I have come to speak a truth that has been buried beneath layers of necessary evil until it choked us all." The silence that followed carried the weight of implications that could shatter empires. Around them, Imperial fists maintained positions with disciplined precision, but Dawn could sense their uncertainty growing like frost in the spaces between certainty and doubt. This was not the enemy they had been trained to fight, not the shadowy manipulator who struck from darkness and disappeared before retaliation could be organized. "Truth is a foundation," Dawn said finally, his chainsword remaining sheathed, but his hand resting upon its grip. "Not a weapon to be wielded when other deceptions fail. What truth could the architect of Istvan Vivi possibly offer that would not itself be another layer of manipulation?" Alpharius felt the weight of Malcador's revelations settling around him, like armor forged from starlight and regret. "The truth that we were shown visions of two futures, brother. Your victory leading to 10 millennia of stagnation, while chaos fed on humanity's despair, or Horus's swift triumph, burning out their influence before it could take permanent root. We chose betrayal to serve loyalty, damnation to achieve salvation." "The Cabal," Dawn breathed, the name carrying weight that made the chamber's air taste of copper and dying light. Malcador spoke of such entities, Xenos who claimed to see the threads of fate while weaving their own designs into the tapestry. "They showed us what we needed to see," Alpharius continued, his voice carrying harmonics that bypassed rational thought and resonated in the bones of those who heard it. "But they did not tell us that our mastery of deception would make us perfect conduits for deception in return. The serpent learned the taste of its own tail, brother, and found the flavor familiar enough to hunger for more." Dawn's features shifted almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that spoke of questions he had been avoiding since the galaxy first learned to bleed in the name of competing visions of humanity's destiny. "You would have me believe that the Alpha Legion's betrayal was orchestrated by forces beyond your control. that the architects of fratricide were themselves victims of manipulation by entities that understood your nature well enough to perfect it. I would have you believe that we are all pieces in a game whose rules we never learned, Alpharius replied, staring at his gauntlets as if seeing them clearly for the first time. That the comfortable certainty of necessary evil may be the most dangerous trap of all. I came to choose truth over deception, honest confrontation over necessary lies. The words hung between them like a blade suspended over everything they had built together across decades of shared brotherhood. Dawn studied his brother's face, seeing in it the accumulated weight of choices that had transformed love into betrayal and loyalty into its own form of treachery. Then let us test the weight of truth, Dawn said, drawing his chainsword with the deliberate ceremony of someone performing a ritual that had been written in the stars before either of them learned to speak. Let us see if honesty can cut deeper than deception, if plain speaking carries more force than riddles wrapped in shadows. Alpharius drew his own blade, the weapon's activation field casting harsh light across walls that had witnessed the planning of 1,000 victories. For the Emperor, he said, though the words carried meanings that had been carved from necessity and regret. For the truth of what we are, Dawn replied, and in those words lay the philosophical chasm that would be measured in blood across the chamber's consecrated ground. The first exchange rang like a bell that had been waiting centuries to sound. Ceramite meeting, adamantium, in patterns that spoke of brotherhood transformed into its own negation. They moved with the measured precision of surgeons operating on the fabric of reality itself. Each blow a question about the nature of loyalty and sacrifice. Each parry an answer that might reshape the galaxy's understanding of what it meant to serve the greater good. The chamber rang with the music of honest warfare, each clash of blade against blade, writing verses in a song that had waited millennia to be sung. Alpharius moved with fluid precision that spoke of water finding its level, his chainsword carving arcs through air that tasted of ozone and the promise of endings. Dawn met each strike with architectural certainty, his movements bearing the weight of mountains that had learned to defend themselves against time itself. This was not the shadowy assassination that had defined Alpha Legion methods, nor the overwhelming force of Imperial Fist doctrine. This was philosophy made manifest in ceramite and blood, two visions of duty testing themselves against absolute conviction. You speak of manipulation, Dawn said, his blade catching Alpharius's thrust and turning it aside with movements that spoke of 10,000 hours of practice distilled into perfect economy. Yet you chose betrayal. You stood at Istvan and watched loyalist blood paint the ash fields, while claiming service to a greater good. How does knowledge of alien influence absolve such choices? Alpharius pivoted, his counterstrike aimed not at armor, but at the philosophical gap between intention and action. Sparks cascaded like dying stars as their weapons met, each impact sending vibrations through ceramite that resonated with the accumulated weight of their shared history. Because the alternative was 10 millennia of stagnation, brother. The Emperor entombed in golden machinery, screaming psychic agony across the galaxy, while his Imperium devoured its own children in the name of maintaining order. The words carried implications that made reality shiver around the edges. Around them, Imperial fists maintained positions with disciplined precision, but their certainty was beginning to crack like ice under pressure as they witnessed their Primarch engaged in combat with an enemy who spoke of love disguised as betrayal. Visions, Dawn replied, his voice carrying undertones that bypassed rational thought and resonated in bone. Possibilities, futures that may never come to pass. You damned yourself and your legion based on prophecies spoken by Xenos, who had their own reasons for wanting humanity to burn bright and brief. And you would damn us all based on faith in a father who may have been using us as unwitting instruments, Alpharius countered, his blade finding the gap between pauldron and gorget, only to meet ceramite as dawn twisted with surprising grace. Tell me, brother, when did loyalty become indistinguishable from blindness? When did duty transform from conscious choice into mechanical repetition? They moved across consecrated ground, like dancers performing steps choreographed by forces beyond understanding. Each strike a question about the nature of service, each parry an answer carved from the weight of brotherhood transformed. Dawn's riposte came with avalanche force, his chainsword seeking the space between Alpharius's ribs where ceramite met softer joint materials. I have never claimed perfection of understanding, Dawn said, his voice making the chamber's walls resonate like struck bells. Only that some foundations must be preserved regardless of cost. Without loyalty, without duty, without willingness to serve something greater than individual understanding, we become nothing more than weapons-seeking targets. And with them, Alpharius replied, deflecting the thrust while his left hand found a combat knife that had tasted blood on 17 worlds. We become instruments in games whose rules we never learned, playing parts in narratives written by forces that understand our nature well enough to perfect it. The knife struck with surgical precision, seeking the gap between helm and gorget, where even Primarch physiology remained vulnerable. But Dawn had anticipated the move, his head tilting just enough that the blade carved ceramite rather than flesh, while his counterstrike opened a wound across Alpharius's sword arm that painted the chamber floor with blood identical to his own. Then let us write our own ending, Dawn said, his voice carrying decisions that would echo across millennia. Let us choose what we serve and accept consequences without hiding behind prophecies or comfortable certainty that our damnation serves some greater purpose. They separated, circling with measured precision of predators who had learned to respect their prey. Blood dripped from wounds that would heal in hours, but the philosophical cuts they had opened would scar across lifetimes. The chamber's air grew thick with implications that could reshape the galaxy's understanding of choosing loyalty over betrayal, duty over doubt. You still do not understand, Alpharius said, his chainsword weaving patterns through air that seemed to thicken with each movement. The choice was never between loyalty and betrayal. It was between two forms of service, two ways of loving something enough to be damned in its name. I chose to be remembered as traitor, so humanity might have a future worth remembering. And I choose to be remembered as loyal, Dawn replied, his blade meeting Alpharius's in a bind that brought them face to face across crossed weapons, so that loyalty itself retains meaning in a galaxy that has forgotten the difference between service and slavery. The final exchange came with sunrise inevitability over battlefields, where all the dead had chosen sides with perfect clarity. Alpharius's thrust sought the space beneath Dawn's breastplate, where ceramite gave way to softer materials protecting vital organs, while Dawn's counterstrike aimed for neck sealing that would end questions with absolute silence. Both strikes found their mark. Both warriors stood for moments stretched like eternity compressed into heartbeats, weapons buried in each other's flesh, while their eyes met across the space between certainty and doubt. Blood flowed in patterns that spoke of choices made and accepted, of love expressed through violence and truth carved from necessary sacrifice. Brother, the dying warrior whispered, though the word could have been addressed to Dawn, or to a twin watching from beyond the ring, or to the galaxy itself. Dawn lowered his blade as if laying a cornerstone, but the structure it founded felt unsound. In the silence that followed, Brother Sergeant Vex felt something unclench and collapse within him. Truth without scaffolding. The body bore Alphorius's colours. The face beneath the fallen helm carried features that had haunted 100 campaigns. Yet the eyes, as they dimmed, held questions that might have belonged to another. Was it him? An Imperial fist whispered. Dawn stared at the motionless form, feeling no triumph, only cold, creeping doubt. The serpent had learned the taste of honest steel and found it bitter enough to swallow whole. But the Hydra's nature was to multiply in darkness. Victory felt like prelude to deeper defeat, and in the growing silence, the only certainty was that questions would outlive answers, and the Alpha Legion's greatest deception might have been teaching the galaxy to doubt the truth of its own eyes. The war for humanity's soul had claimed another Primarch, but the doubts raised, the philosophical wounds opened, would fester in the Imperium's heart for millennia to come. The chamber fell silent with the weight of mountains learning to grieve, broken only by the soft whisper of cooling ceramite and the distant pulse of the phalanx's heart. Rogel Dawn stood over the fallen figure, his chainsword still humming with the resonance of truth carved from flesh and bone. Yet victory tasted like ash in his mouth. The face beneath the shattered helm bore features that were both familiar and wrong, carrying that unsettling quality common to all Alpha Legion operatives, as if reality itself could not decide who had truly died. Was this Alpharius, architect of Istvan's betrayal, or Omegon wearing his brother's face in one final deception? The question hung in the recycled air like poison gas, and Dawn understood with growing horror that uncertainty had been the serpent's final gift to a galaxy that had forgotten how to doubt its own certainties. Which one? An Imperial fist whispered, voicing the question that would echo across millennia. Dawn lowered his blade, feeling no triumph, only the cold realization that he had struck down either a traitor or a loyalist, and the distinction no longer seemed to matter. The philosophical wound opened by their confrontation would fester in the Imperium's heart long after the physical scars had healed, teaching future generations that even victory could be indistinguishable from the most complete defeat. Light years away, in the command chamber of the Alpha, where hololithic displays cast serpentine shadows across walls that had witnessed the planning of bloodless conquests, Omegon felt the severance like a blade drawn across his soul. The constant hum of shared consciousness that had defined his existence since birth fell silent with surgical precision, leaving him alone with thoughts that felt foreign in their singularity. He pressed his palm against the observation dome's cold surface and tried to remember the last time he had been certain which reflection belonged to whom. Brother, he whispered to the void, testing the weight of a word that had lost half its meaning. The stars offered no answer, only the patient indifference of cosmic forces that ground civilizations into dust, while remaining untouched by concepts like loyalty or betrayal. The Cabal's visions replayed in his mind with cruel clarity, not as prophecy, but as manipulation so complete it had become indistinguishable from truth. They had shown him futures where the Emperor's victory led to 10 millennia of stagnation, where Horus's swift triumph burned out chaos before it could take permanent root. Yet as reports filtered in from across the galaxy, Omegon understood with growing horror that they had achieved neither salvation nor damnation, only a synthesis that combined the worst elements of both fates. The Legion fragmented like a mirror struck by hammer blows, each shard reflecting a different interpretation of their purpose, while cutting anyone who tried to piece them back together. Brother Sergeant Vex, drifting through the void with his kill team aboard a ship whose name changed with each port of call, received orders that bore authentication codes from Primarchs who might or might not still exist. Some cells continued fighting the Emperor's Imperium, believing they executed swift burn strategies to starve chaos. Others, seduced by bone tokens carved with symbols that hurt to perceive, served the very corruption they had sought to prevent. Most existed in the spaces between certainty and doubt, carrying out missions whose purposes pulled in contradictory directions, while serving masters they could no longer identify. We split, Vex told his warriors in a cargo hold that smelled of machine oil and accumulated lies, not as enemies, but as consequences. Some followed paths that led toward Omegon's cold mercy, others toward whatever truth Alfarius had died protecting. Vex chose neither and both in the old way, a route through ruins that preserved questions more dangerous than any answer. Centuries bled into millennia like coolant from ruptured lines, invisible and deadly. The Imperium that rose from the heresy's ashes bore scars deeper than shattered worlds or broken legions. It carried in its very genetic code the philosophical wounds opened by brothers who had chosen to love each other enough to become enemies. Where the Great Crusade had promised human enlightenment, now there was only the grinding machinery of oppression elevated to religious doctrine. Where there had been hope for peace through strength, now there was endless war against enemies that multiplied like cancer in the body of a civilization that had forgotten how to heal itself. 10,000 years after Pluto's confrontation, in the depths of a hive world whose name had been lost to administrative error and deliberate forgetting, a figure moved through shadows that seemed deeper than mere absence of light. It wore no distinctive markings, no heraldry that might identify allegiance or purpose. Yet something in the way reality bent around its passage spoke of training that predated the current millennium by epochs that made mortal lifespans seem like heartbeats. The Emperor, as the Cabal's visions had prophesied, sat entombed upon the golden throne, his psychic screams echoing across the galaxy, while 1,000 souls were sacrificed daily to maintain his agonized existence. Yet chaos had not starved as the alien prophecies had promised. Instead, it fed like a parasite on the very suffering that imperial doctrine generated in the name of maintaining order. The Imperium's xenophobia, its suppression of knowledge, its elevation of ignorance to virtue, all of it served to create exactly the conditions that allowed the ruinous powers to flourish in the spaces between official truth and lived reality. The long game, the figure murmured to shadows that had learned to listen with patience, spanning geological ages, played by hands that understood our nature well enough to perfect it. We chose betrayal to serve loyalty, and in doing so, we ensured that both loyalty and betrayal would become meaningless distinctions. In the distance, a star entered its final collapse, shedding shells of light like serpent skin while painting the void in shades of amber and despair. The figure watched that cosmic death with eyes that might have belonged to Alfarius or Omegon, or neither, understanding that they had become living embodiments of the question that refused to answer itself. The Alpha Legion persisted not as a unified force, but as doubt made manifest, a hydra whose heads had multiplied in darkness until even they could no longer count their own number. The serpent had learned the taste of its own tail and found it bitter enough to sustain itself across millennia, carrying the burden of questions that would outlive empires and the terrible knowledge that some truths were more dangerous than any lie. In a galaxy that had forgotten the difference between service and slavery, between loyalty and blindness, they remained as living reminders that uncertainty was the only honest God, and that the greatest victories were often indistinguishable from the most complete defeats. The Hydra's heads multiplied in darkness, each carrying fragments of truth too dangerous to speak aloud, too necessary to abandon. And in the end, that contradiction was the only certainty that mattered. The Alpha Legion was dead, yet the Alpha Legion endured, forever asking whether love could be expressed through betrayal, whether the greatest loyalty sometimes required the greatest treachery, whether salvation and damnation were merely different words for the same cosmic joke played by forces that had been laughing since before the first human looked up at the stars and wondered what watched them in return.